Eduardo's mansion stood, proud and solitary, amidst the vast wild gardens that stretched across the hills of rural Minas Gerais, a sanctuary of luxury and, paradoxically, of an oppressive silence. Inside, the millionaire's life, once a whirlwind of business and travel, had condensed into a sterile routine, bounded by the reach of his state-of-the-art wheelchair. 5 years prior, a car accident had stolen his legs, but more cruelly, it had stolen his hope, leaving a wound that time wouldn't heal. His deepest desire, to feel the ground beneath his feet again, was a silent lament, drowned in the cynicism that became his shield. He refused to believe in any disinterested kindness, saw hidden intentions in every smile, and his resignation to the silence of his own isolation was his greatest internal lie, the anchor that held him to that golden prison. The gentle rain, which now kissed the library windows where Eduardo spent most of his days, no longer carried the scent of wet earth and wild flowers he so loved. It was just a distant noise, a liquid shroud covering the outside world, reinforcing his reclusion. His fingers, once agile in multi-million-dollar contracts, now tapped impatiently on the armrest of his chair, a nervous tick betraying the restlessness of his soul. He watched the drops trickle down, each carrying away a piece of time that refused to heal. The truth is, behind the facade of self-sufficiency, Eduardo yearned for connection, for a hand that saw him not just as a fortune to be exploited, but as a shattered man. It was on one of those humid afternoons when the wind whispered ancient secrets through the centuries-old oaks surrounding the property that the unthinkable happened. A homeless man, named Ignacio, with skin weathered by the sun and a soul cleansed by the elements, appeared at the mansion gates. He wasn't asking for alms, he wasn't asking for shelter, just the chance to speak with the man of dormant legs. The security team, trained to ward off any intruder, found the man's calm and insistence strange. He didn't have the demeanor of someone asking, but of someone offering something, and that was, at the very least, curious. The head of security, a stern man named Valerio, approached the electronic gate with the caution of someone dealing with the unexpected. "What do you want, sir?" he asked, his voice grave, but without his usual harshness. Ignacio, his eyes fixed on the imposing mansion, replied in a voice that wasn't rough, nor begging, but imbued with a strange authority. "I need to speak with Eduardo. I have something important for him, something no one else can give." Valerio, accustomed to flimsy excuses and forced pleas, felt a shiver. What kind of homeless man spoke like that, without a hint of hesitation? Valerio's curiosity, and perhaps yours, was already piqued. And speaking of curiosity, tell us your name and what city you're watching this story from. It's always good to know who's with us. Valerio, of course, repeated the protocol. "You don't have an appointment. Dr. Eduardo doesn't receive visitors without prior notice." Ignacio simply smiled, a tired smile, but one that held a unique sparkle in his eyes. "I don't need an appointment. The truth doesn't wait for schedules." He gestured with his hand, revealing a small, worn, leather-bound notebook, almost an amulet, which he kept in his shirt pocket. It looked like an antique piece with edges worn by time and use. It wasn't a valuable object, but the way Ignacio held it, almost reverently, gave it a different weight. "It's all here," Ignacio murmured, more to himself than to Valerio, as he ran his thumb over the notebook's cover. What kind of secret could a man like Ignacio carry in such a simple object? Ignacio's insistence, devoid of any threat, yet firm as a rock, began to erode Valerio's wall. He knew that Eduardo, in his isolation, was averse to any novelty, any interruption. But there was something about Ignacio that didn't fit the intruder pattern. It was a silent dignity, a certainty that defied logic. Valerio hesitated. Should he turn the man away as he would any other? Or should he at least report the peculiarity of the situation to Eduardo? Ignacio's voice then echoed again, closer, almost a whisper that carried through the gate. "Tell him Ignacio will make him walk again. Tell him the miracle only happens when he feels the touch on his knee." The phrase, so direct and impossible, hit Valerio like lightning. Walk again? A miracle? The security guard, who didn't believe in fairy tales, felt the strangeness of those words. He knew how much Eduardo detested any mention of his condition, any false promise. It would be an affront, a cruelty. But the way Ignacio spoke without mockery, without fanaticism, just with serene conviction made him think. Valerio then did what he rarely did. He broke protocol. He picked up his communicator and, with a sigh, called the library intercom, where he knew Eduardo would be. "Dr. Eduardo, forgive the interruption. There's a man at the gate. His name is Ignacio. He says he can make you walk again." A heavy silence filled the line, a silence that seemed to extend throughout the mansion. Eduardo, on the other side, heard Valerio's words with a mix of disbelief and anger. What kind of nonsense was that? Who dared to play with his pain? The millionaire, accustomed to manipulating the world around him, felt a heat rise to his neck. It was the indignation of someone who feels outraged, whose wound has been so crudely exposed. He thought about hanging up, about ordering Valerio to expel the man unceremoniously. But something in Valerio's words, in his slightly disturbed voice, stopped him. A homeless man asking for nothing, claiming to be able to achieve the impossible. It wasn't a request for money, nor a threat. It was a provocation, yes, but a provocation with a strange promise. Would it be another charlatan? Another opportunist trying to take advantage of his fortune and vulnerability? Eduardo had seen many of them over the years, and his cynicism was a well-polished armor. But curiosity, that old enemy, began to gnaw at the edges of his armor. What could a man with nothing want besides what money could buy? He moved in his chair, the soft creak of the wheels breaking the library's silence. "Tell him I don't have time for antics, Valerio. Send him away." Eduardo's voice was cold, cutting, but Valerio noticed the hesitation, the small pause before the final order. He knew that the boss behind all that harshness was a man who, deep down, still sought a light, no matter how much he denied it. And Ignacio, outside, seemed to have noticed it too. "He doesn't need time, Valerio. He needs faith. Tell him the notebook doesn't lie." The mention of Ignacio's simple and very personal object, that worn notebook, made Eduardo stop. What would a homeless man know about him, about his life to carry notes? That detail, so small and seemingly insignificant, planted a seed of doubt in the millionaire's mind. It wasn't just an empty promise, it was something more. What else did Ignacio know? And what, after all, was written in that notebook? Eduardo couldn't ignore that mention, a little notebook, from a homeless man. What could be in it that connected him to him? His mind, trained to find flaws in contracts and market strategies, now found itself in a labyrinth of speculation. Could it be some disguised blackmail? An elaborate form of extortion? He had dealt with such cases before, but Ignacio's approach was different. Without the aggression or common glibness of opportunists, there was an almost brutal sincerity in his words, a certainty that disarmed. Valerio, sensing his boss's hesitation, waited in silence on the intercom, holding his breath. He knew that Eduardo was at a turning point, between anger and the curiosity that eroded his isolation. "Valerio," Eduardo's voice suddenly rang out, lower, laden with a weight that wasn't anger, but something akin to exhaustion. "Bring him, but under my supervision, in the living room, and you keep an eye on him the whole time." The order was clear, but the breach of protocol was monumental. Valerio nodded, even though Eduardo couldn't see him, and disconnected the call. He felt a mix of relief and apprehension. What would happen next? That day, Valerio knew, would be unlike any other in the mansion. Ignacio outside seemed to sense the change in the air. He merely watched Valerio approach the gate, a faint smile on his sun-cracked lips. "Will he receive me?" Ignacio asked, his voice calm, as if he already knew the answer. Valerio opened the gate and gestured for him to enter, keeping his distance. "Dr. Eduardo has agreed to see you, but no funny business, and I'll be present." Ignacio merely nodded, his eyes scanning the mansion's well-kept gardens, as if searching for something beyond the obvious beauty. He didn't seem impressed by the luxury, nor intimidated by the security. It was as if he was exactly where he was supposed to be, without haste, without fear. As he passed through the gate, he paused briefly, picked up a small rosemary sprig that had fallen from a bush, and put it in his pocket, a simple gesture that didn't escape Valerio's notice. What would a man from the street do with a sprig of rosemary inside a mansion? In the living room, Eduardo waited impassive in his wheelchair. The room, with its antique furniture and valuable paintings, seemed suffocated by tension. He watched the door, Ignacio's notebook still hammering in his mind. What did he expect to see? A madman? A skilled charlatan? When Ignacio entered, guided by Valerio, Eduardo scrutinized him from head to toe. Worn clothes, but clean. A direct gaze, without subservience or defiance. There was nothing threatening in his figure, but also nothing fragile. He was just a man in his raw simplicity. "Are you Ignacio?" Eduardo asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Ignacio took a step forward, stopping at a respectful distance. "I am, Dr. Eduardo, and I've come to fulfill a promise." Eduardo scoffed, a sound of disdain. "A promise? You barely know me. And if you think you can make me walk, you're very wrong. I've seen many like you. Do you want money? A chance? Speak up." The millionaire's voice was a whip, testing the homeless man's resilience, but Ignacio wasn't fazed. He pulled the notebook from his pocket, that same worn notebook, and held it open in his hands without showing it. "I don't want your money, Dr. Eduardo. I just want you to allow yourself to believe and to hear what this notebook has to say." The mention of the notebook again. Eduardo felt another chill. That object, so insignificant, was becoming a central point in the conversation. Ignacio leafed through a few pages, his eyes fixed on something only he saw. "You lost your legs 5 years ago, didn't you? In an accident on the old road to Ouro Preto. A day of heavy rain. The car skidded on a dangerous curve, near that old abandoned chapel." Ignacio's words were like stones falling into a well, each echoing in the silence of the room. Eduardo paled. How did he know all that? Those were intimate details he rarely shared. Valerio, who stood nearby, also felt the impact. The abandoned chapel, the old road. These were not public information. Eduardo fixed his gaze on Ignacio, disbelief mixing with a pang of fear. How do you know that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Ignacio raised his eyes from the notebook. "It's all here. And not just that. On the day of the accident, you were returning from a meeting. There was an important contract for land for a new venture. And you were concerned about the environmental protection clause, weren't you? You wanted to ensure the native forest was preserved even if it cost more." Eduardo felt a knot in his throat. That was impossible. No one, absolutely no one, knew those details. It was a confidential negotiation, a personal dilemma he had kept under wraps. That homeless man couldn't have access to such information. Eduardo's cynicism began to crumble piece by piece. He had closed himself off from the world, but the world, or at least Ignacio, seemed to have found a crack in his fortress. The notebook wasn't just an object. It was a key, perhaps, to memories he had tried to bury. But what would Ignacio gain from this? If you're following this story and wondering how a simple notebook can hold so many secrets, you're not alone. The truth often hides in the most unexpected details, doesn't it? And if you also believe that social justice and truth should always come to light, no matter where they come from, comment below using the hashtag #touchoffaith. Let's uncover what really happened together. Ignacio closed the notebook with a soft click, like someone guarding a treasure. You see? These aren't facts you find in newspapers. These are truths that only someone who was close, in some way, knows. Eduardo felt a chill. Who was close? He tried to remember someone, but his mind was blank. The only person who knew these details was his former partner, who had passed away 2 years after the accident. But Ignacio didn't know him, or did he? The idea of a conspiracy, of something bigger, began to take shape in his mind. He, the astute businessman, was being caught in a game he didn't understand. He was facing an enigma that defied his logic, his reason. And with each word from Ignacio, the wall he had built around himself began to crack. That rosemary sprig in Ignacio's pocket, the small detail Valerio had noticed, now seemed to hold new meaning. A subtle clue, almost a reminder of something old and forgotten. Was it just a coincidence, or was Ignacio planting other seeds of curiosity, other small pieces of evidence that would only make sense later? Eduardo, despite all his pride and distrust, couldn't tear his gaze away from the homeless man. He didn't have the answers, but he felt that Ignacio possessed them, and the prospect of finally understanding something about himself, about that accident that changed his life, was a temptation too strong to ignore. What else did Ignazio keep in that notebook? And what would be the true cost of unraveling these secrets? Eduardo, clutching the St. Christopher medal, felt the weight not just of the metal, but of all the truths Ignazio was unearthing. His mind, once so sharp at uncovering traps and hidden intentions, now stumbled on unfamiliar ground. Disbelief still lingered, but it was eroded, replaced by an urgent need to comprehend. You haven't answered me," he said, his voice firmer now, but still trembling. "Why did you keep this? Why did you care about a stranger's accident?" Ignazio observed the millionaire, a shadow of compassion in his gaze. "We care about what touches us, Dr. Eduardo, and your accident that day touched me differently. To see a man so broken, trapped there, made me think about the fragility of life. It wasn't for money or for fame, it was a premonition, a voice that told me not to forget." He paused and then continued, his voice almost a lament. "I didn't deliver it before because you weren't ready to listen. And I wasn't ready to speak." Ignazio's explanation, devoid of any material interest, disarmed Eduardo even further. He had always believed that everything had a price, a selfish motivation, but here was a man who defied all his beliefs. The feeling of being indebted, of having been the object of a disinterested kindness, was almost unbearable for him. His fortress of cynicism, built for years, crumbled under the weight of that simplicity. Valerio, a silent witness to the scene, also felt himself on shaky ground. That homeless man seemed to possess an invisible power, an ability to see beyond appearances that others lacked. "But how did you know the details of the contract, the environmental clause?" Eduardo asked, returning to logic, seeking a crack of rationality in that sea of emotions. "That wasn't in any newspaper." Ignazio smiled faintly, a smile that seemed to carry 1,000 stories. "Ah, Dr. Eduardo. Walls have ears, and roads have stories. After you were taken away, I couldn't leave. I stayed there near the chapel, and I found something else, something the paramedics in their haste left behind." Ignazio then opened the notebook again, not to read, but to remove a crumpled, yellowed page from it. It was a fragment of a report with the letterhead of a law firm. On it, some words were underlined by hand: Environmental Protection Clause, Negotiation Deadline, and a name, almost illegible, of an old partner of Eduardo's who had died years later. "This was on the ground near your car wreckage. It seemed important, so I kept it. And over time, listening to conversations in the city, the murmurs about the accident and the business of the Hill millionaire, I started putting the pieces together." Eduardo took the fragment, his hands trembling, the name of his former partner, the firm's letterhead, the underlined words. That was concrete evidence, an official piece that corroborated the story of the contract and the clause. But why would that fragment be at the accident site? And why was the partner's name there? A pang of suspicion, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The accident, which he had always accepted as a fatality, suddenly took on darker contours, a complexity he had never imagined. The feeling that a piece is missing intensified, transforming into a black hole in his mind. It was no longer just about his physical recovery or his faith. It was about the truth behind that fateful day. Eduardo's emotional cost increased exponentially. The physical pain in his legs, which he had learned to endure, was now accompanied by an excruciating mental pain, the pain of doubt, of betrayal. His accident was not just a disaster. There was something more, something hidden that Ignazio, the homeless man, seemed to have uncovered before everyone else. Valerio, watching Eduardo's expression, realized that his boss's curiosity had turned into a relentless quest. What did Ignazio know that could shake not only Eduardo's life, but perhaps the reputation of others? The rosemary in Ignazio's pocket, that simple and seemingly insignificant detail, now seemed like a premonition, a scent of mystery that deepened with each revelation. Eduardo could no longer ignore the possibility that his life had been shaped by a lie, and that the truth, however painful, needed to come to light. He was trapped no longer in his chair, but in the web of secrets that Ignazio unraveled one by one. Eduardo felt a chill down his spine when he saw his old partner's name on the paper fragment, the same man who had died years later, taking so many secrets with him. A wave of anger mixed with old pain hit him. Could it be? His partner? Someone he had trusted for years. Had he played a part in that accident? The idea was poison, corroding the last defenses of his soul. He had always believed in fate, in the cruelty of destiny, but now a shadow of intent hung over everything. Ignazio, with the calm of someone who had already traversed the labyrinths of human pain, perceived the storm in Eduardo's eyes. The mind plays tricks, Dr. Eduardo, and pain often blinds us to what really happened. His words were not a judgment, but an invitation to reflection, a gentle push beyond the first and most obvious conclusion. The homeless man seemed to possess a clarity that the millionaire in his bubble of privilege had lost. Eduardo clutched the report fragment in his hand, his knuckles white. That paper, so harmless at first glance, was now the tip of an iceberg, revealing a much more complex and dangerous landscape. He remembered old fights with his partner, disagreements over business ethics, but never ever had he imagined something so nefarious. What else did Ignazio know that could unmask the truth behind that personal tragedy? Valerio, who had been observing in silence, felt the gravity of the atmosphere. He had never seen Eduardo so vulnerable, so exposed. The man who controlled empires was now at the mercy of a homeless man and a worn notebook. That rosemary sprig in Ignazio's pocket, almost forgotten, seemed to carry a premonition, a scent of mystery that thickened with each revelation. "And what else, Ignazio?" Eduardo asked, his voice hoarse, almost begging for answers. He no longer wanted to be deceived, not even by his own convictions. "What else do you keep in that notebook that could change everything I thought I knew?" It was a point of no return, an abyss from which there was no going back for the old Eduardo, cynical and isolated. The truth, no matter the cost, was the only way. Ignazio then flipped through the notebook again, his calloused fingers stopping on a specific page. He carefully removed a faded photocopy of a section of an official document. "This, Dr. Eduardo, is part of the accident report, the one that was filed as fatality." He handed the copy to Eduardo, who took it with trembling hands. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible detail, but it would make all the difference. In the upper corner of the paper, in tiny letters, was a handwritten note, almost a scribble, of a name and a phone number, followed by an acronym, IW, Eyewitness, and directly below, a crossed-out line as if the information had been discarded. This witness, Ignazio explained, pointing to the note, was a truck driver who was passing by on the road. He claimed to have seen a second car, a dark sedan, braking abruptly right in front of yours, forcing you to swerve. The official investigation deemed the testimony unreliable and filed it away. Eduardo felt a punch to the gut. A second car, a discarded eyewitness. The fatality he had carried in his heart for 5 years crumbled. That information, so vital, had been swept under the rug, conveniently ignored. Why? Who would have an interest in covering up the truth about his accident? His mind reeled, trying to connect the dots. The contract, the deceased partner, the environmental clause, and now a second car and a silenced witness. The pain of betrayal was a new fire, more intense than physical pain. He had been a ruthless but fair businessman. Now it seemed he himself had been the victim of a much crueler scheme. Ignazio's notebook, with its notes and fragments of truth, was a map to a dark treasure, a map that Eduardo, in his blindness, would never have found alone. Valerio beside him felt the heavy air of revelation. The truck driver, the second car. He vaguely remembered the rumors at the time, but everything had been hushed up. That homeless man wasn't just telling a story. He was rewriting history, unearthing a truth that everyone, including Eduardo, had accepted as a lie. What else did Ignazio know about that truck driver? And why had his version of events been so conveniently forgotten? The feeling that a piece is missing was no longer a suspicion, but a brutal certainty. Eduardo, clutching the report fragment, felt the weight of the truth crush him. It was no longer about an accident, but about a plot, a betrayal. The name of his deceased partner, which before seemed like a coincidence, now resonated like a macabre echo. "The truck driver," he murmured, almost to himself. "Do you know who he is, Ignazio?" Ignazio nodded, his eyes fixed and calm. "Yes, Dr. Eduardo. I found him. He lives in the village nearby, a bit forgotten. His name is Zé da Pamonha, and he hasn't forgotten what he saw that day." The mention of the name, so simple and real, brought a new layer of verisimilitude to the story. Zeda Pamonha. Not a ghost, but a man of flesh and blood with a story to tell. The turnaround was complete. Eduardo, the skeptical millionaire, was now faced with a truth that dismantled his reality. His accident was not a fatality, but an orchestrated event, a crime. Anger simmered in his chest, a cold, calculating anger, unlike anything he had felt before. It was the anger of someone who had been deceived, manipulated, robbed of 5 years of his life, not only of his legs, but of his very notion of justice. He looked at Valerio, who seemed as shocked as he was. "Valerio, get the car ready. We're going to the village, now." Eduardo's voice was no longer that of a broken man, but of a general giving orders. Authority, once veiled by cynicism, emerged with full force. Valerio, without questioning, simply nodded and hurried to comply. He knew the game had changed, and Dr. Eduardo was back. Ignacio watched the transformation, a discreet smile on his lips. He had planted the seeds, and now the tree of truth began to bloom. "It's not just Zeda Pamonha, Dr. Eduardo," Ignacio said, before Eduardo could move. "There's one more thing, something your partner, before he died, left behind. A regret, a confession." Eduardo stopped, his hand on the chair's armrest. "Confession? Where?" Ignacio nodded towards the notebook. "It's not written in here, but he told me. He knew he was dying, and he didn't want to carry that weight to his grave. He asked me to deliver a message to you, a message about a safe deposit box, a bank, and a letter." The revelation was a shock. The partner whom Eduardo thought had died in peace carried a terrible secret, a safe deposit box, a bank, a letter. These were the new pieces of evidence, the clues that would lead to the final truth. Eduardo felt an urgency that propelled him. He couldn't wait. Justice, after 5 years dormant, was about to awaken. He picked up his cell phone, his hand still trembling, but his mind sharp. "Valerio, cancel the trip to the village for now. Call Dr. Lucia, my lawyer. Tell her it's an emergency, that I need her here with utmost urgency. And ask her to check about a safe deposit box in my old partner's name at the central bank in the city." Eduardo's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Dr. Lucia, a renowned and implacable lawyer, was the real tool, the restorative authority he needed. Ignacio, in silence, merely observed. His role as messenger was fulfilled. From that moment on, the truth would be uncovered not by him, but by the force of law and the determination of a man who finally had allowed himself to see. What would that letter reveal? And what would be the true motive behind such deceit? Dr. Lucia, with her impeccable posture and penetrating gaze, arrived at the mansion in record time. She was a force of nature, a lawyer who bowed to nothing, and the urgency in Eduardo's voice had alarmed her. Without preamble, she listened to Ignacio's story, analyzed the report fragment and the mention of the safe deposit box with a sharp mind, already plotting her next moves. Within hours, confirmation came. A safe deposit box in the deceased partner's name existed, and a court order for its opening was issued with the swiftness Lucia's reputation allowed. At the bank, under the watchful eyes of Eduardo, Lucia, and Valerio, the safe deposit box was opened. Inside, besides some irrelevant documents, was a sealed letter, yellowed with age, addressed to Eduardo. The handwriting was unmistakable, his former partner's. The letter was a confession, a belated lament from a man tormented by remorse. In it, the partner detailed how, driven by ambition and the pressure of a deal Eduardo wanted to protect environmentally, he had orchestrated the accident. He had paid the truck driver, Zeda Pamonha, to simulate an abrupt swerve, forcing Eduardo to deviate, hoping only for a scare, a delay in the contract, never the tragedy that followed. The report fragment, the hidden witness, Ignacio's notebook, everything now fit into a painful and cruel truth. The letter revealed the brutal truth. Eduardo, a businessman accustomed to betrayals, felt the pain of a friend's perfidy. It wasn't just the loss of his legs, but the loss of faith. Lucia, the lawyer, was already planning the next steps, but the wound was deep. The partner paid Zeda Pamonha, the truck driver, to disappear, but remorse made him leave a trail. Ignacio, the homeless man, with his sensitivity and contacts, unearthed this truth. He gave Eduardo the chance to rise again. Eduardo felt the weight of the notebook and the medal. He looked at Ignacio, whose eyes gleamed. They shook hands. The miracle wasn't walking, but feeling, believing, and having the strength to seek justice. With Lucia, the case was reopened. Zeda Pamonia was located, his testimony crucial. Justice, though delayed, moved forward. Eduardo sought reparation, not revenge, using his fortune to expose the truth, protecting others from similar schemes. Ignacio refused rewards, agreeing to be a consultant in a new foundation created by Eduardo, focused on vulnerable communities and injustices. The touch on the knee, which made him believe, healed his soul, opening his eyes to compassion and truth emerging from the most unexpected places. And so the rain that once seemed like a shroud now washed Eduardo's soul, promising a new beginning. He did not walk again on his own legs, but found a greater purpose, a way to walk again, no longer isolated, but connected to humanity and justice. His mansion, once silent, became a center of hope, where truth was always welcomed. If this story touched you, if you feel that truth always finds a way, even in the most forgotten alleys, I invite you to leave your comment and tell me where you are watching from. Your support is fundamental, so we can continue sharing stories that make us reflect and connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones.